Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast which takes a deep dive into the rich, complex and often controversial history of RAF Bomber Command. I'm James Jefferies and today my usual co-host Jane Gulliford Lowes is essentially acting like a guest as Jane's latest book, The Invisible Campaign, Bomber Command Gardening Operations 1940 to 1945 is released this month. To time with the release, this seems a perfect opportunity really to discuss some of the myths that surround this vital but little discussed part of Bomber Command's work. Now, whenever gardening gets mentioned, there's always someone who says, oh, it was just for learner crews, or it was much less dangerous than bombing operations, all that. Arthur Harris thought it was a total waste of time. And I know that Jane starts to turn purple when anyone says any of these things. So hopefully we can dispel a few of those myths during the course of this conversation. But before we begin, Jane, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I've had an extremely busy week finalising the Norway purchase. So that's hopefully all going through next week, which is very exciting. Planning my next trip out there. What else have I been doing? Doing loads of book-related stuff. And I was lucky enough to be invited to the International Bomber Command Centre for the Women in War event last week, which was lovely. So it was so nice to be on a panel with Sarah Lou Miller, who we've had previously on the show, Claire Mully and Jeannie Benjamin, all great female authors. And it was a really big event. All the bigwigs were there, met the head of the RAF and all sorts of people.
Oh, wow.
This and Lady-in-Law that and whatever. Yeah. And one of the most wonderful things was we had the first ever all-female RAF fly past, the entire cruise. So there was, I can't remember what the first
Fantastic
aircraft was, but then there was an Atlas and then there was a Typhoon. And then all the aircrew came into us at lunch to have a chat, which was absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Gosh, that sounds fantastic.
Great. Yeah, it was a fantastic day. The whole purpose of the day was to unveil these new statues by Standing with Giants. Well, I call them silhouettes rather than statues, commemorating the role of women who served with the RAF in the military in the Second World War. It was a really, really fantastic day. Really, really enjoyed it. But it's always a good day out at the International Bomber Command Centre. So if you haven't been, folks, please
Completely agree.
Visit. It is absolutely wonderful. It's not a museum per se, although they do have a sort of exhibition, what have you, but it's just a lovely place. And I can also highly recommend the cafe. It's magnificent. So there we go.
Yes.
So yeah, that was a nice day. And what else has happened? Oh yes, I've been invited to speak to the Royal Aeronautical Society, which is a bit...
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, when was I there? I think it was November. It's an incredible place.
I've never been before, so yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, that came totally out of the blue, so... Very exciting. That's in June. So yeah, it's all happening.
Brilliant.
So anyway, let's get on with it, shall we?
Yes. We're here to talk, of course, about the Invisible Campaign. I got my copy, was it 2 days back? And it's just glorious looking at it. But it really is. It's beautifully, and obviously fantastic, really, really important stuff. But the book itself, the images of the maps and such like is just what beautiful. So before we get onto the Invisible Campaign, can you tell us a little about your previous books that you've written?
Yes, I've written 2 previous books. The first one has absolutely got nothing whatsoever to do with the Second World War, but it's basically how I got into writing. And that's a story of a box of letters and photographs that I inherited from a family friend, which turned out to be from a pioneer family in Australia. And it's all about their story, really, how I pieced together what had happened to them and about their connection with my sort of hometown and what have you. And it basically spans about 60 years between the 1880s and the early... Well, it goes up to about 1940, I guess. And the sort of family stories that are all interwoven with my own family's story as well. So that's how I first got into writing. That's called The Horsekeeper's Daughter, and that came out in 2017. And incredibly sold thousands, which was amazing. The next book, which kind of follows on from there, 'cause it's got some of the same people in it, was Above Us the Stars, which is the story of a 10 Squadron wireless operator who I've talked about a lot on the show previously, and that's my great uncle Jack Clyde, who flew with 10th Squadron between May 43 and March 44. So he's really absolutely in the thick of the campaign. It's all about what happens to him and his crew, but also it explores a bit of the background of Bomber Command. There's lots of stuff about Jack's experiences, his family's wartime experiences in the northeast of England as well, but also sort of what happens to the crew afterwards, when their tour finishes and they go their separate ways. Some make it, some don't. And it's got a really lovely twist at the end as well. That's basically where I was up to before I started Invisible Campaign. But I got into that because, well, when I was writing Above Us the Stars, I discovered that Jack and his crew undertook about 5 mine-laying operations, I think. And when I was researching it, I couldn't find any information about mine-laying anywhere. There just wasn't anything. And as a result of doing that book, I realised basically just how little I actually knew about the Second World War, and how most of my knowledge was based on kind of the popular histories and Second World War films. So I decided that I really needed to approach this from an academic point of view. So that's when I signed up for the master's degree in Second World War history at the University of Wolverhampton, with which you are very, very familiar. And it was during that course I was looking for a subject to write my dissertation on, and I thought, well, why don't I do mine laying? And everyone said, oh, you can't write about that. There's no information. I was like, well, yeah, that's kind of the whole point. And boy,
Absolutely.
Is there information if you know where to look, believe me. So I put that to John Buckley, and he was like, yeah, absolutely, go for it. He was really supportive. And so, yeah, I began my mine laying journey there, really, and wrote the thesis, and then it kind of turned into the book, I suppose. And here we are.
Brilliant. Yeah. That's something I always notice. Like, you're looking at the Everett Middlebrook book of all the operations, and almost every other night there's mine laying happening. And you go, well, I don't really talk about that. It's always about the trips to Essen or Berlin or such like. So yes, fantastic to see some attention on it, much needed attention. But for those unfamiliar, we've been using the phrase gardening, and to clarify, this isn't a book about RAF crews or ground crews growing begonias or sweet peas outside the sergeant's mess, is it, Jane? Can you tell us what the term gardening refers to?
Yeah, gardening means laying of aerial mines in enemy waters by RAF aircraft. Why is it called gardening? When the operations were about to commence in April of 1940, the RAF realised that they needed some code words for this, because they didn't want to refer directly to mine laying in case signals and what have you were intercepted by the Germans. So some bright spark in the Air Ministry came up with the idea of calling it a gardening operation. The minefields themselves were known as gardens and were given horticultural names such as geraniums, nectarines, onions, anything you might grow in an allotment, basically. And the mines themselves were turned vegetables. So you could have a code message saying, I don't know, number 83 squadron, can you please sow 15 vegetables in forget-me-nots? And the Germans would be, even if they intercepted that, they'd be going, what the hell? What are they talking about?
What on earth is going on?
Yeah. So that's how it became known as gardening. And there were numerous gardens right down almost from the Spanish border up the French Atlantic coast, right across the northern European coast, right up into the Baltic, and right up and around the coasts of Denmark and Norway. So it's very much a coastal operation, this.
Yeah. I mean, we'll dive into this obviously a little bit more, but can you tell us a little about the mines themselves? Now, I've seen people comment online. They're not the big round mines with spikes on that you see in Dad's Army and such, like, are they? Can you tell us a little bit more about them? Because sometimes people think they are, and
well, it's an easy mistake to make, and it's one which lots of people do mistake. No, these are air-laid mines. The ones with the big round spikes on are naval mines. They're dropped from ships. Normally, and they are normally contact mines, and they will usually sort of float around and crash into a ship. You've seen, is it the Sea Shall Not Have Them, where they with Dirk Bogarde when they're in the raft and they're prodding away. Have the mine away with an oar or something like that. One of those old war films, anyway. Well, yeah, it's not that. Okay, so these are large, sort of canister, cylindrical shaped objects, which are about 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters long, with a parachute cap on one end. I'll explain more about the parachute cap later on. But these mines are designed to be dropped from aircraft and laid in relatively shallow waters. So we're talking about harbours, ports, estuaries, even rivers and canals. And they are designed to lie and lurk on the seabed or the riverbed until they are activated or triggered. Now, there are different types of mines, but the two main types that the RAF used were magnetic mines and acoustic mines. So a magnetic mine is, as it just says on the tin, basically, it is triggered by the passing overhead of a large metal object, i.e. a ship or or boat or some kind of vessel. An acoustic mine operates in a slightly different way, and that is triggered by the passing overhead of the noise from a vessel's engines. So it's the sound which triggers it. There's a really complex, really technical pieces of kit, and they come in various combinations which develops throughout the war. The technology is constantly evolving, and they are absolutely lethal. And they're really, really sneaky because they can be fitted with various mechanisms which prevent them from sort of triggering for 3 months, 6 months, even a year. They can self-sterilize, which means they can be deactivated automatically after, say, a period of a month if you don't want that area to be mined anymore. We'll talk about that in the context of the Normandy invasion later on. There's a really, really crafty device whereby they will just lie there on the seabed, and they can be swept overhead by German minesweepers looking for them, and they won't trigger, they won't detonate until, say, being passed over 6 or 7 times, by which time the Germans think it's clear and they're sending their vessels out or their subs or whatever, and bang. So the mines don't destroy vessels by a big explosion. You're not looking at massive amounts of flames or something suddenly blowing up like you see on TV or on films. What they do is when they detonate under the water, they create a massive pressure wave. And it's the pressure wave which then hits the bow or the underneath side of the ship or sub, and basically causes it breaks the spine of the vessel and causes it to pretty much to break in two. And that's what destroys it.
So what were the aims of the mine-laying campaign? You know, you've mentioned a little bit about where the mines were going to be laid. Could you go into any more sort of detail about that and how the campaign might have changed, etc.?
Okay, right. I think we first need to distinguish between different kinds of mine laying. You've got defensive and offensive mine laying. So defensive mine laying is the laying of mines in one's own waters, basically to protect your shipping, ports and harbours and supply routes from attack by enemy vessels. Then you've got offensive mine laying. This is the laying of mines to target enemy shipping in his or neutral waters. And that's what Bomber Command's mine laying is all about. It's about taking the campaign to the enemy. And what are the aims? Well, it's basically to disrupt enemy merchant vessels, supply vessels, to obstruct communications and to disrupt trade and logistics. So although the concept of using aircraft to plant mines was really envisaged before the outbreak of the First World War, even going back that far, it wasn't until the Second World War that aircraft could successfully mine in quantity because obviously the size of the aircraft required. And only then did the advantages of aerial delivery become apparent. First, you've got speed and flexibility of response. Second, you've got the capability of replenishing the field without the risk of self-inflicted damage from the field itself. So what that means is that aircraft can get in, they can drop the mines, they can go home again, but then they can go back to the same area once that it's been swept by the Germans or to put in additional mines. Obviously, if you're doing that by ship, you can't do that. Once you've laid the mines, that's it, you can't go back. You've got to get out there. It can also get into places where Royal Navy can't get. So there's this sort of one of the myths, again, about mine laying, that, you know, these aircraft are just dropping mines in the middle of the North Sea or, you know, out in the middle of the Atlantic somewhere. That's absolutely not the case. That's what the Royal Navy was for. The point of aerial mining is that you are getting to places that the Royal Navy can't get into. So directly into enemy ports, directly into enemy harbours, into their main shipping lanes, the narrow channels around Denmark and Sweden and the coast of Norway, all of that sort of area. The Kiel Bay, where a lot, and the sort of around Danzig area, where a lot of the U-boat training takes place, etc. The Royal Navy couldn't get in there. They would be, you know, absolutely destroyed. So it's all about reaching the places that the Royal Navy can't reach. So the greater part of Bomber Command's mine laying is directed against the German merchant navy and supply shipping. So we're not talking about particularly targeting Kriegsmarine vessels here. It's about obstructing German sea communications. But as far as Arthur Harris was concerned, there was 2 particular objectives, really. So the first was when the Ruhr Valley was being heavily bombed, the mining campaign made every effort to obstruct the supply of iron ore to that region from Sweden and Spain. And secondly, it was intended to result in the disruption of sea communications in the Baltic, by which supplies and reinforcements reached the German army in Russia. So that's certainly part of the evolving campaign, but initially it's all about targeting logistics and supply.
I think it'd be good here to just make a little attempt at talking about when and why the campaign started.
We need to go back to about 1936 for this one. And there's a note sent by Arthur Harris to the Admiralty in 1936 with this idea for an air-laid mine. And he's basically saying, I think we need to think about this. For any coming war, we need to be ready. We need to be prepared to target enemy vessels by using our aircraft rather than just by naval mining. And round about the same time, the Navy, the Admiralty are having very, very similar ideas. They think, yeah, this is something that we need to be doing. But instead of sort of coming up with a joint plan, there's then a massive fight between the Admiralty and the RAF as who is going to have responsibility for this development of this new weapon. Harris actually calls it the H-bomb. Why he calls it that, I've got no idea, but yeah, he calls it the H-bomb initially. But then the name eventually changes to air-laid mine. So there's this massive bust-up between the Admiralty and the RAF, and the politicians are actually brought in to try and sort it out. And eventually a sort of preliminary plans are put in place for the development of this weapon in kind of late 37, early 38. And by sort of mid 39, they've got something that they can test, but it's a very, very long way from a finished weapon. Then, of course, war breaks out and kind of intervenes. And the Germans, it's the Luftwaffe, have had the same idea, but their plans are probably about 6 to 12 months further on than the British. So they actually begin mine laying in British ports, harbours, rivers and estuaries almost from the get-go. So from autumn of 1939, they're already doing this, and it's causing absolutely massive destruction to British merchant vessels. So this basically gives the Admiralty and the RAF the kick up the backside that they need to get this sorted out. And so they come up with a plan that the Admiralty will build the mines, the Admiralty will decide on the targets, because obviously they're the experts in seaborne trade and, and sea warfare. They will decide when and where the mines are to be laid, but then Bomber Command will be responsible for actually delivering the mines. And Bomber Command will have the final say as to whether or not the operation can take place, because it's always going to be subject to what else they've got on, which is bombing or whatever else that they're doing. And it's going to be dependent on the weather and the resources that are available to them. So Bomber Command have the final call. So Bomber Command aren't actually ready to begin their mine-laying campaign until the April of 1940. Now, everyone thinks that Bomber Command's not doing anything much in 1940, but this is something which we've already touched on in the show.
Something I felt passionate about, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, particularly with regard to the invasion of France and Battle of Britain that we've talked about as well in great detail. But at the same time as all of that is going on, Bomber Command is also doing mine laying. So the campaign commences round about the 13th, 14th of April 1940. So this is just a couple of days after the Germans have invaded Denmark and Norway, obviously, as well. So it's done on a very, very small scale at first by Hamden's from 5 Group, which, of course, Harris's group. And he's so enthusiastic about the campaign right from the get-go, because basically it's been his baby. It was what he was one of the people who came up with the original idea in the first place and who's pushed it. So he's very, very keen for it to be given the green light. So April 1940, and it's Bomber Command's longest campaign of the war. Mine laying continues from then right up until the beginning of May 1945. And it doesn't really stop. It's an ongoing operation. Now, if you look at any Bomber Command's crews' logbooks, there's a very, very high chance that that crew will have undertaken at least one mine-laying operation at some point during the tour. And this is because it was an integral part of what Bomber Command did. Absolutely integral. But for some reason, the reasons that we'll discuss later on, it just gets completely overlooked. It just doesn't get talked about.
How far an area then did mine laying take place over? You kind of touched on this, but is it mainly around Germany's coastline? How further afield does it go? And maybe talk about, as the war develops, how it changes.
It's everywhere. So any occupied coastline in basically northwestern Europe and Scandinavia is a target for Bomber Command mine layers. So we go right from, as I've said, from the south of France, right up the French Atlantic coast, where all the U-boat bases are. So places like La Rochelle, La Pallice, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, all those kind of places. Then around into the Channel, up into around ports like Cherbourg, Dieppe, those kind of places. Then right up to around Calais, then into the coast of Belgium, then around into the Netherlands, the Frisian Islands, right around the entire coast of Denmark, the German North Sea coasts, which aren't massive, but then round into the Baltic area as well. So really it's probably as far east as Danzig, maybe a little bit further east than that. But then also right up around the coast of Norway, right up into the Oslo fjord, right up almost to Oslo itself, right round the bottom. So places like Haugesund, Stavanger, Kristiansand, Bergen, and even further north than that, almost up to Trondheim. So it's an absolutely massive area. Coasts anywhere are subject to mine laying. But it doesn't just happen in northwestern Europe as well. There is some mine laying done in the Mediterranean too. And also, as we get into 44, along the Danube River, which people tend not to know about, but once Italy had been, or substantial parts of Italy had been occupied by the Allies and the Foggia airfields weren't made available, mine laying could take place from there. And the mine layers were then targeting the Danube, but particularly oil transports. It's all about disrupting the oil transports and also the flow of troops, etc., who are now in retreat, obviously from the Black Sea area back up towards Germany. So yeah, it happens everywhere. If there's water, Bomber Command will lay mines in it, basically.
Well, this ties in nicely with the next question, which that mine laying wasn't just around, in the sea, around ports, the coastline. There were canals and rivers targeted too. Why exactly was this?
Because again, it's that whole thing about targeting waterborne logistics. So anything that moves on the water is a target for Bomber Command's mine layers. So you're looking at the massive barges which are used to transport goods and material and raw materials around the waterways of northern and central Europe, the Danube, as we've mentioned, but also the canals, like the Kiel Canal, which obviously cuts across the top of northern Germany and basically links the North Sea coast to the Baltic Sea coast of Germany. So yeah, basically anywhere where there's water is a target. Anywhere where there's sort of trade and commerce taking place is a target.
You mentioned the Hamden. Now, were there any particular types of aircraft that undertook mine laying or ones that were more favoured for the role? Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah. So this was one of the reasons why the mine laying campaign was delayed initially. It was that because there just weren't any suitable aircraft to actually deliver these mines. Initially, they were going to be led by bolters, which were kind of non-suitable. And when the campaign took place, there was only really the Hamden that was considered suitable. But as the campaign expanded and as the war developed and as aircraft production increased throughout the course of the war, every kind of bomber flown by RAF Bomber Command was adapted from the get-go so that it could deliver mines. So you had Hamdens that we've talked about. We've got Lancasters, obviously. We've got Halifaxes. We've got Wellingtons. We've got Stirlings. We've got Bostons. We've got Manchesters. But then, surprisingly, we've got Hudsons. We've got Liberators. One aircraft that people will absolutely not believe was capable of delivering air-laid mines, which delivered a lot of them in the early part of the campaign, at least from between 40 and 42, was the wonderful Swordfish, the biplane.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And this played quite a significant role in the early part of the campaign because at this point in time, it's not just Bomber Command that are doing these operations. Coastal Command have been drafted in to help out as well. They weren't very happy about it, but they were drafted in to help out too. And even the Fleet Air Arm got involved a little bit as well. So yeah, if it flew and if it was tough enough and heavy enough and had the lift power to carry a mine, basically it got involved. And that was the situation throughout the war. Every aircraft was adapted for this purpose. And I think that also gives an indication as to the importance of the campaign as well. If it's not that important. If it's just an afterthought or a sideline, why go to the bother of ensuring that every bomber that is built is capable of carrying mines? I mean, the Hamdens, when they start out, they're only delivering one. Later, maybe two. Then when the heavies come on board, the Halifaxes are delivering 4, as are the earlier Lancasters too. But by kind of late 44, early 45, the Lancasters are able to deliver 6 of these mines. And these things are absolutely massive, bear in mind as well. So if it wasn't important, why would they go to all that bother of ensuring that, that every aircraft, every bomber that was built was capable of carrying these weapons?
Absolutely. Really, really good point there. On the subject of coordination, we talked a little bit about how the Royal Navy, but also the Admiralty, when it came to mine laying ops, what was the coordination there? I'm thinking not only on a grander scale, but also day to day.
Right. Okay. So right from the very get-go, there was a team of mine specialists from the Royal Navy seconded to RAF Bomber Command headquarters in High Wycombe to assist with the planning of the mine-laying campaign. And they were there right from the early days in 1940, right up until the end in 1945. The main guys involved were Captain de Mowbray and Captain John Cowie, who were absolute geniuses when it came to mine warfare. Cowie is a figure that I talk about a lot in the book because he was so influential and so important regarding the development, and also the outcome of the campaign. He was a man who understood how mine warfare worked, and he understood exactly what needed to be done in terms of target selection. You need people who understand tide times. You need people who understand currents and river flows and, all of this kind of thing. You also need people who understand how seaborne and waterborne trade actually works. So, people in RAF Bomber Command aren't going to understand that. You need naval experts for that particular purpose. So it's a very, very close cooperation throughout. Harris paid, ongoing tribute to his naval team throughout the course of the war and afterwards. They worked very, very closely together. And this is a perfect example of a very early example of a combined operation, because this is basically what it is. It's the Navy and the RAF working in absolute sync. It's perfect from the get-go.
Also on the subject of coordination, and we mentioned Coastal Command, who I'm a bit of a rabbit hole going in recently, want to know more about. Absolutely incredible story, Coastal Command. Their link to mine laying and Bomber Command, was there a conflict of interest here, and how exactly did they work together?
Coastal Command played quite a bizarre role in all of this, really. At the beginning, the Admiralty would do everything through Coastal Command rather than Bomber Command. So the actual delivery and organisation of the mines to the RAF squadrons, that was all done through Coastal Command for some reason. But Coastal Command were also being involved in the delivering and the laying of the mines from an early stage too. However, they didn't really have the numbers of aircraft, obviously a constant problem which plagued Coastal Command throughout, to be able to make a massive contribution. And they certainly felt that their resources were being stretched and that were being pulled in too many different directions. Basically having to do mine laying on top of their ordinary duties, on top of their sort of coastal protection work and reconnaissance, etc. So this caused some friction and some conflict between Coastal Command and RAF Bomber Command, and it eventually kind of reached a head in 1942, really at the point in time when Harris took over Bomber Command. Coastal Command didn't want to be involved anymore. Their losses were too high. They didn't have the resources. They were too overstretched. Harris didn't really want Coastal Command involved anymore either, because he wanted it to be a Bomber Command gig, basically. He wanted to have complete control over the entire campaign. So in the end, a kind of compromise was reached whereby Coastal Command's involvement was gradually phased out. Very gradually, I have to say. They were still undertaking some mine laying ops in the early part of 43, although they were few and far between. But yeah, eventually by sort of mid 42, certainly by early 43, this was almost an exclusively Bomber Command controlled operation.
Now, this is the big question, the triggering question, is that it seems that some people think and have suggested that gardening operations were an easy op, that it was meant for perhaps new or less experienced crews. And this isn't true at all, is it?
Well, this is something of a myth which was more or less created by the RAF itself during the war. And the reason for this was that a policy was implemented quite in probably mid-42, late 42 into early 43, that new crews coming into Bomber Command and joining their operational squadrons were to be given a mine-laying operation to do as their first operation, just to sort of get their eyes in, if you like, as to how to handle the aircraft, etc. Now, this is a policy which really waxed and waned, and to be honest, never really was implemented to any great extent across the squadrons, because operational requirements just meant it just wasn't feasible. So, for example, in 1943, around about 100 new crews joined 10 Squadron, one of the squadrons that I've researched in great detail. And of those 100 or so new crews who joined in 43, only one of them had the luxury of a mine-laying operation as their first operation. Most crews will have undertaken mine-laying at some point in time, but not necessarily as a first op. So to think or to say that it was just something which new crews did, I think is simply not true. So going on to the issue of it being an easy op, again, that is something of a myth. I think that was partly because of this thing of it being given to new crews, but that policy was found to be flawed in many, many ways, because the losses on mining operations, particularly throughout 1942, were increasing steadily. And you get to a point where mining losses are really no different to bombing losses. So you're looking at something in the region of about 3 to 4%. But there are instances of operations, I think in 42 and into 43, where losses were between 10 and 12%, which is massive. And because of this, Harris commissioned a report from the Operational Research Section at Bomber Command, basically looking into this. Why are so many aircraft being lost on mine-laying operations? And a number of reasons were identified for this. One of the reasons was that the aircraft were sent out quite often in very bad weather, when it was too bad to conduct bombing operations. Harris implemented this policy to best utilise the resources that were available to him. And that was that bombing would take place and would be given priority in good weather, but when the weather was too bad for bombing, mine laying would take place. So bombing good weather, mine laying in bad, which of course then automatically puts the mine laying crews at a higher risk. So particularly throughout the winter months, long dark nights, that's when your mine laying takes place. It's laborious work. You sometimes have to go in over the target area several times. You can't just sort of randomly go in and drop your mines in the general vicinity. These have got to be laid at very, very precise coordinates, which are provided by the Admiralty, because they've got to be directly in the shipping lanes or directly in the the routes coming out of harbours or ports or whatever. So it's dangerous because of the weather. There's lots of instances of aircraft icing up and having to return. That's exactly what happened to my uncle's crew on a mine laying up. I think that was in February 44. They'd got out somewhere off the North Sea heading towards Denmark, and they were all called back because the weather was so appalling. The crews were reporting icing, and they just had to come back because it was just too dangerous to continue. So the weather is a massive problem. There's also the issue of the mines having to be dropped from a relatively low altitude. Now that exposes you to a number of hazards, not least anti-aircraft fire from coastal defences. So the aircraft are coming in because it's coastal. They're coming in very, very close to enemy anti-aircraft defences, both actually onshore, but also from things like flak barges as well, which are absolutely lethal. So these are large vessels which are basically laden with anti-aircraft guns and kind of mode offshore to attack any incoming aircraft. So there's that hazard. But again, there's also the issue of crews becoming disoriented because they are flying at very low level, flying in darkness, flying over the sea, and there's numerous instances of the aircraft just going into the sea. The problem was the early mines, so 40 up to probably even as far as early 43, these mines are having to be laid from height of between about 500 and 1,500 feet, which is very, very low indeed. So you are flying over the coastline or whatever. You're sitting duck for anti-aircraft fire, for flak. Yeah, and it's just so dangerous. And the third thing that you have to think about is, where are these crews actually going? Okay, if you're flying to the French Atlantic ports, you just fly down south over England, you fly over the Bay of Biscay, then come in, make your mining run, drop your mines, and then fly out to sea again. If you are mine laying in somewhere like Kiel Bay or around the coasts and channels, around sort of Copenhagen area, that sort of area, you are over enemy territory a lot of the time. There are enemy vessels everywhere. There are these flak barges everywhere, and you're a sitting duck basically. And the vast majority of losses that were suffered by Bomber Command were in the eastern minefields, so eastern coast of Denmark, eastern coast, the North German Baltic coast, Kiel Bay, that sort of area, round to Danzig, those sort of places. Because to get in position to be able to lay your mines, you've got to run the gauntlet. Basically, it's extremely dangerous, and this is one of the things that the operational research team actually picked up on, just how many losses were being suffered in the Eastern Gardens, the Eastern minefields. So it was decided that this idea of sending out rookie crews was absolute suicide. That wasn't going to happen anymore.
No.
So a policy was devised whereby the more experienced mine-laying crews, the crews who been on a few bomber operations over Germany, who knew how to get out of trouble, who knew how to corkscrew out searchlights, who knew how to take evasive action from night fighters, etc., they were sent east. And the less experienced crews, who probably wouldn't have as much of that to deal with, were sent down to the coast of France and the Atlantic ports. And that's how they worked it out. And once they started doing that, losses did begin to decrease a little.
I wondered if you could take us through a typical guarding op and what was expected when crews undertook them.
Okay, so I think we need to go back to training. Bomber crews received no airborne training for mine-laying operations whatsoever. They received training in bombing, but not in mine-laying. The information they were given was in the lecture hall. So it was all just theoretical, basically. It was a case of easy coordinates, go and drop your mines there, fly home again, job done kind of thing. That was pretty much it. There wasn't even a sort of a handbook regarding mine laying until I think it was at the early 44. The Luftwaffe have got a beautiful mine laying book with lovely coloured diagrams and all this kind of thing, which bizarrely they were still updating in the spring of 45. No, they weren't actually doing many mine laying at that point in time. Yeah. There's a copy of that in the National Archives. So yeah, the training for this was minimal. And in terms of the actual operation itself, it took place pretty much like any other bombing operation would. The crews would be summoned to the briefing hall, told what they were doing, rather than, you're not bombing Essen tonight, you're going to be mine laying in the Frisian Islands or the Gulf of Danzig or whatever. It was basically exactly the same. So the only thing that differed really would be the weapon itself, which was obviously fitted into the aircraft. Mines were armed quite often by Royal Naval specialists who were sent out to the squadrons who were undertaking mine laying to actually arm the mines or to train the RAF armourers in how to set these things up. So that was something that was slightly different. But the rest of it was pretty much the same. I mean, the hazards were exactly the same, if not more so, for the reasons that I've explained. As far as the crew was concerned, it was no worse, no better than doing a bombing operation, but apart from the fact that you're probably going to be doing it in really appalling weather. So again, the briefing would be the same. They'll be given their coordinates. The navigators in particular have a particularly difficult job here because they've got to navigate, usually by dead reckoning, to a fixed point where the mines have got to be laid. In the early part of the war, obviously, the navigational technology just didn't exist for pinpoint navigation. So quite often they would actually be given a landmark on the coast to aim for. So, say, for example, a lighthouse or a tower or something like that. They would fly towards that, then take a bearing, then fly back out towards the sea, calculate the coordinates from there, and then drop the mine. So it was extremely dangerous having to do that. But obviously, as technology developed and things like H2S developed, etc., it became easier to lay the mines to those specific coordinates. As the technology got better, the mine layers were also able to lay their mines from higher and higher altitudes. So I just mentioned before, you're looking at between 15 and 1,500 feet in the earlier part of the war. But as technology developed, by sort of early 43, it's about 6,000 feet. And then early 44, you've got high level. They're doing it from 15,000 feet because they now have the navigational and the aiming technology to be able to do that. So that made a massive difference. And because of that, the losses began to decrease rapidly.
Kind of brushed on it, but what were the crew's feelings about gardening ops?
There's not a great deal of information recorded about this because people just weren't interested in asking the crews about it. Harris was always very keen to push the mining agenda, and one of his great bugbears throughout the war was the lack of publicity that his mine-laying crews were getting for the really important work that we were doing. Because one of the things that we haven't mentioned and that we should perhaps touch on now is the fact that it was massively successful right from the get-go, right from April 1940. The Germans are suffering big losses of merchant ships, troop ships, trade vessels, etc. But there's no publicity for the crews at all. And Harris constantly complains to the press, to the Admiralty, to the Air Ministry, basically to anybody who will listen, and throughout the course of the war, trying to get these guys the recognition that he feels that they deserve. So the crew's feelings about gardening operations, I think, were mixed. It was laborious, it was tedious, it was dangerous. There's no instant result like there is on a bombing op. You know, if you're flying over Berlin or Dortmund or whatever, you drop your bombs, you can see the results immediately. You can see the massive explosions. You can see all the fires burning. On a gardening op, what do you see? A splash, if you're lucky, in the dark. And that's it. You know, your mine might sit there for 3 months, 6 months, a couple of years before it actually does any damage. It might never do any damage. Yeah. And let's face it, a lot of them are still there. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but yeah. Put it this way, I won't be swimming in the Oslo fjord anytime soon. But yeah. So I think the crews were sort of made to feel that it was just kind of like a routine and tedious task with there's no instant gratification. Well, gratification is probably not the right word, but there's no instant results. There's nothing for them to report when they come back home again. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I think that the feelings about it were mixed. And even though it was dangerous, it was very much sort of played down because of that. Nobody wants to hear about that when you get back to base. Yeah, they want to hear about somebody, you know, being tackled by 3 Jerry night fighters on the way back from Kiel or wherever, but no one wants to hear about you dropping your mines off La Rochelle and coming home again. You know, it's not interesting. It's not exciting. It's not glamorous. And I think it really kind of suffered because of that.
On the sort of subject of materials, I know finding pictures, you know, I remember chatting to you about that, you know, taking a photographs that have been dropped in the dark at low level at sea. There's not a lot out there. But what sort of materials were you using for the book? And I wonder if you wanted to share any that were of particular interest.
Yeah. So when I first thought of this project, there was one professor who I won't name who said, mine laying, what on earth are you going to write about there? There's no information. What are you going to write about? Which was like a red rag to a bull as far as I was concerned. And believe you me, if you know where to look, there is so much information. So I spent, well, I wouldn't say days, probably weeks ultimately, in the National Archives at Kew, going through all the archival material. It's all there if you know what to look for. There's so much all about the development of the mine, all about the battles between the Admiralty and the RAF in the early days, all the sort of plans for the initial implementation of the campaign, even down to the actual signals being sent out to the squadrons themselves, you know, go and lay X amount of mines in this minefield here on this particular night or whatever. Then there's all the intelligence reports about the vessels which have been sunk. There was the establishment of the Enemy Shipping Losses Committee, which looked at the reasons for enemy vessels going down and whether it could be attributed to, say, I don't know, submarines or mines or even just bad weather. The reasons for the losses of these vessels had to be established. So, yeah, there was so much information there, but I also kind of looked at squadron operational record books as well. I tried to gather as much information as I could from veterans as well. And I was very, very blessed that I was able to obtain a very detailed account of one particular operation that my uncle's crew took part in, and that was a mine-laying operation, La Palisse La Rochelle U-boat base in March 1944. This was actually their penultimate operation. And the tail gunner of the crew, Bill Bradshaw, who I was actually lucky enough to meet a short time before he passed away, he had written a detailed account of this operation, which only came to me several years later via his daughter, Angela. And he goes into great detail about what occurred on that operation. It's one of the few really detailed contemporaneous accounts of what went on. So I was drawing on material like that, but I kind of wanted to get sort of a very balanced view. I didn't want it just to be all about the tech development. I didn't want it just to be all about the policy and strategy. Yeah. And I didn't want it to be just, ex-crew flew out and dropped their mines here and then came back again and whatever. So I also looked at what was the experiences of the people who were at the sharp end of this. In other words, what was it like aboard a German minesweeper? What was it like being aboard a German merchant vessel, being escorted up and down the coast of Norway? What were the hazards that they faced? So again, I was able to obtain some quite detailed documentation and accounts from the National Archives from the MI9 interrogation records of captured German seamen. There was a lot of information in there, which was really, really helpful. And I also managed to obtain, I'm going to wave it in front of you here, even though our listeners won't be able to see it, but this is an original log.
Oh, wow.
From the captain of a German minesweeper.
Gosh.
M1806 Spitsbergen. Which I managed to track down and purchase online.
Incredible.
And I've had some of it translated. And it provides a really, really interesting insight, because I didn't want it just to be all from the RAF point of view. I wanted to explain what's it like at the opposite end. I think that's really, really important. I think that's something that we've tried to do throughout the course of this podcast, is what is the other experience like, in terms of being on the sharp end of bombing or whatever. So I think blending all of those things together, I hope, has produced a really sort of balanced and rounded picture of what this campaign was and what the impact was.
I want to ask a little bit more about Harris and his views on gardening. You mentioned a little bit, but is there anything else you can add?
Yeah. So Harris often is criticised, or how can I phrase it? I'll put this another way. There's this myth which is built up around Harris. Whenever you mention gardening operations, people always say, oh yes, Harris thought gardening operations were a complete waste of time. But I think I've hopefully shown that the opposite is true. Harris is absolutely instrumental, and he is pushing it from day one. I think where that myth has arisen is because he certainly complained about the amount of mine laying that Bomber Command were required to do, certainly towards the end of 42, and definitely in the run-up to Overlord in early 44. Harris's problem was that mine laying was very, very successful. So the Admiralty wanted the RAF to do more and more and more of it all the time. But at the same time, obviously, their raison d'etre is strategic bombing. And they're being required to carry out more and more and more bombing all of the time as well. And something's got to give. They don't have the resources to do everything that's required. And I think there's this massive sort of flare-up. And there's this memo which is basically Harris having a hissy fit in February 44, complaining about the amount of additional mine laying that his crews are having to undertake when they're already doing everything else and they're really under the cosh. So this is round about the time of Big Week. So all that's going on at the same time as well. The Overlord plans are being drawn up. He's being told that, well, as well as doing all this strategic bombing, you're going to be mine laying around the coast of Normandy and around northern France. But we also want you to keep mine laying around the Baltic, to keep the U-boats penned in. But we also want you to continue to paste German cities, and we want you to continue to paste German transport targets as well. So, he's sort of tearing his hair out basically saying, how am I going to do all of this with, the resources that I've got available? And I think that's where that myth has sort of arisen, that he was against mining, but he absolutely wasn't. And if you read his memoir, he mentions mining a number of times and basically sings its praises and how successful it was throughout.
That's a fascinating book, isn't it? I think it's worth reading if you haven't and you're listening to this. Yeah, pick it up, have a read of it.
Yeah.
I guess the next thing really is, the wider sort of knowledge of gardening. What was the view at the time? And I'm thinking here from the perspective of the British public, how evident was it made to them that it was happening and how important it was?
Right. Well, from the outset, it was mentioned. So there would be reports in the newspapers of the latest bombing raids, and there would always be a sentence at the bottom of those reports, and mining operations continued. And that was it. What does that mean? Nobody knows what that means. It means absolutely nothing to Joe Bloggs. So as I've said, Harris was always keen to get this information out to the press, but he had to struggle because nobody was really interested. If you look at those little sort of publications that were produced by HM Stationery Office throughout the war to basically inform the public about what's going on with various campaigns and whatever. They were usually for sale in the post office or the local news agents or whatever. There are a couple about Bomber Command, and they do feature. Mining does feature in those. I think it's also mentioned in the Coastal Command one as well. So there were efforts made to try and educate the public as to what was going on. But of course, again, because it's not glamorous, because it's routine, people kind of always see it as an aside, almost as an afterthought or a little extra that, something that Bomber Command did when they didn't have anything else to do or whatever. So it kind of, I think, got overlooked and bypassed because the bombing campaign was considered to be so important and was considered to be the be-all and end-all in the popular imagination. Obviously, it's been publicised in the newspapers, in broadcasts on the radio all the time as well. There was a BBC radio programme called, is it We Speak from the Air, which was basically... accounts by RAF personnel of their various operations, like anonymised accounts. How much of it was actually true and how much of it was actually scripted, I don't know. But the idea was to basically inform and educate the public as to what was going on. And there is an account of a mine-laying operation there. And the guy who sort of delivers that account basically explains how that it is dangerous and it is tedious and it is routine. It's not glamorous because there's no instantaneous result. They don't know whether their mines are going to ever sink a ship or not. And I think that it kind of brings across the crew's frustrations really around the whole campaign.
Well, that is the end of part 1 of this fascinating conversation. For subscribers, part 2 is available right now. Non-subscribers will have to wait. If you're not a subscriber and you really want to listen to part 2, then the link will be provided. But otherwise, we will see you for our next episode soon. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Good.